we call post-colonial? What is post about post-colonial? So that is the question that we need to begin with. So what is colonialism? So there is a political economic angle to colonialism as well as a cultural angle to colonialism. So there is the economics of imperialism when we talk about colonialism. Then there is also cultural angle when we talk about hegemony. So, Ranajit Guha, when he writes a book, Dominance Without Hegemony. Ranajit Guha is a pioneer of subaltern studies, founder of subaltern studies School of Indian Historiography. So, the group which wanted to look at post-colonial, colonial Indian history in a very different perspective, largely from a popular perspective, where colonial India, the temporality of colonial India was to be looked at on the basis of events, the British policies, but subaltern studies group was actually looking at this whole idea of popular perspective, called people's history. So, or what we call as the history from below. And I will begin from here. Of course, there are many ways in which the idea of post-coloniality itself has to be understood. But why do we call it as post and not call it as after colonialism? So how do we differentiate between colonialism, decolonization, and post-colonial and pre-colonial? So pre-colonial, where, and I'll be dealing largely from the Indian example. The pre-colonial period, we look at largely before 1757. And let's go a little bit to history. And before getting into the theoretical part of what we call as the post-colonialism and what is post about it, we need to understand the historical context in which we have actually lived our lives. So we all know 1757 to 1947, it sounds like the title of, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's book, Placido Partition. So that is where British colonial history got enacted. And 18th century, there were many ways in which colonialism actually came into India. It was not a conventional military venture. It was rather a kind of influence that spread surreptitiously. Surreptitiously in the sense, it cannot be called as an invasion. So like the Islamic invasion of the 11th, 12th centuries. But the Britishers came as a surreptitious influence rather than an invasion. We all know the Britishers came as traders, and the imagination of India kept on transforming for the Britishers. Jyotsna Singh writes a book, English and the Discovery of India. So there was a discovery motive. And of course, ironically, she takes the example of Nehru's work, The Discovery of India, and identifies as to how the discovery motif actually transformed from the 16th, rather the 17th century. So if people, most of you must be watching, I think, Prime Video, there is a series, web series called Swaraj. So I request all of you to watch that, those who are interested in the historical part, how India was colonized by the foreign rule, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and then of course the Britishers, and why the Britishers became so significant. So the very idea of looking at the British influence in India has to be looked from the 17th century, when Thomas Roe and Thomas Coriat, the two British ambassadors, came to India and came to Jahangir's court. And the imagination about what we call as the Orient. So what do we mean by the Orient? It's a very loaded terminology. And I'll come to Edward Said's work in a moment. But let me get a brief sense of history. This very idea of the Orient, which is a term given to the non-European East, which is considered to be a homogeneous entity, both spatially as well as temporally. And why do I call it as both spatially as well as temporally? Because spatially, if the non-European East was regarded as one homogeneous entity, like any space beyond Europe, excluding America, because America was colonized and America became part of the Western imaginary, which is called the Occident. The Occident largely comprises of what we call as the Anglosphere, but beyond the Anglosphere, it consists of the European countries, which was dominated by the three classical imperial languages: the Spanish, the Italian, and the Portuguese language. The Spanish, the British, the Portuguese, and the Italian language. So the language became a significant aspect of colonizing space. But the language of imperialism gradually changed to what we call as English, German, and French. So there are 6 languages of imperialism, which is largely European in character. So they are largely European in character. So German, French, English, Italian, Spanish, and the Portuguese. Now, the Europeans were not only linguistically imposing a semantic and semiotic sense of space, as English has done for us. Like, I'll come to Gauri Vishwanathan's work in a moment to make this point. But what we need to understand is, apart from language, culturally, the idea of Occident and Orient is an invention of what we call as Renaissance. Renaissance actually invented space and time. And how did it actually invent space and time? And there is a lot of theoretical work on this. I'll come to it in a moment. But what we say, the precursor to modernity, where colonialism played a significant role, the transitional period from Renaissance to Enlightenment, the major role, the temporal factor that played a significant role in this entire process is what we call as modernity. uh, Renaissance invention of time and space is what I borrow this from Walter Magnolo's works on Renaissance, the darker side of Renaissance. There is another work by Walter Magnolo, the darker side of modernity. Now, why, in that sense, 1498 played a significant role, and that is where that web series actually impacted me significantly, because there is always a other side of history, because we all think that Vasco da Gama actually discovered the sea route to India. But Vasco da Gama was not a discoverer. He was more of a, what you can say, invader like Muhammad Ghori. And why should we compare Muhammad Ghori, Muhammad Ghazni, and Vasco da Gama? He came with the intention of looting the wealth. He did not come with any intention of, trading. So trade was just a camouflage because he wanted to loot the wealth. So there was this golden principle of spices as precious as gold. And that is where the history of Vasco da Gama must be understood. Anyways, and he did not come with the intention to discover the route. He was searching for the resources, and ultimately he ended up discovering India after he found the route from Cape of Good Hope. Now, why that is important? There were so many things that happened. Why 1498 is linked to Renaissance? And it goes back to 1453 when Constantinople was captured by the Ottoman Turks. And that is where the Europeans, especially the Anglophone or the Francophone Europeans, Anglophone and the Francophone Europeans lost the control over the political economy because of the Ottoman Turks, the non-Christians, after the Crusades, capturing the Constantinople, and that was a link that could have, connected Asia and Europe, but through the cultural trajectory of Islam. Now, we need to understand the cultural angle to this. Why did Vasco da Gama come with the mandate of the Pope? And that is where the idea of Renaissance actually must be understood. In school, we were taught that, Renaissance is something, resurgence, revival. Of course, it has no sense for us because we were never in the Dark Ages. It was Christianity that was pushed to Dark Ages, not Hinduism. So in this sense, we need to understand that since Christianity had to be, disseminated, Vasco da Gama came as a proselyter and a looter. Rather than we give a sense of herogiri to Vasco da Gama in our schools, but that needs to be changed. So Vasco da Gama was a proselyter who wanted to convert and change the Hindus into Christians. So he had the mandate of the Pope. And that is where we need to relook at the history. But what does Renaissance mean then? What Renaissance was doing was, there is a religio-civilizational angle to look at the Renaissance, as what Walter Magnolo was trying to do. There was a sense of what we call as epistemicide that Renaissance was trying to impose on others, which is called as the Orient. Again, I'll come to the definition of the Orient. Orient is a geographical category, it's a temporal category, It's a cultural category. It's a racist category. So post-coloniality is all about race, class, and gender. So there is a, race, class, gender, which is culturally loaded with the idea of power. So these are four categories that we need to look at: race, class, gender, and power. And that is what determines the entire idea of post-coloniality. So what Renaissance was doing was to divide the earth into two spatial categories. One is the Europe, and of course, America was always discounted because America became part of the West. But of course, in the 15th century, it was Europe. And the rest of the world was the non-Europe, which later became what we call as the Orient. So Orient can be divided racially, in terms of gender, and in terms of culture. Racially, the superior versus the inferior race, the European superior race, white versus black or brown or yellow. There are various colors. The yellow of the East, like Southeast, East Asia, blacks of the Europe, brown of India, which is juxtaposed, homogeneously categorized as the inferior races as compared to the white superior races. Maturity versus immaturity. There are simultaneous doublets that are created, or what we call in the post-colonial language as alterity of doubleness. Alterity of doubleness. Of course, whatever I'm talking from my own book, which I recently published, which is listed in my CV, Orientalism, Liberalism, and Colonial Governmentality. So if anybody wants to go back to the sources, you can just go to the library or purchase that book and just read it. So the alterity of doubleness is what the Renaissance invention of time and space is concerned. When the Renaissance, this doubleness was to be created racially in terms of gender, male, female. Europeans considered that they were male, and male in a early in a pre-modern sense, where the male was considered to be superior to that of the female. Not in today's context, but we need to look at the context of the 15th century, where only men were considered to be stable, wise, mature, strong, everything, rational. So rationality for men, irrationality for women, maturity for men, immaturity for women. So that was the context in which masculinity versus the femininity determined the racist consciousness as well as the cultural consciousness of Renaissance. So Europeans were to be treated like men, and the non-Europeans were to be treated like women because they were not so rational and mature. So there was a spatio-cultural divide. But the more interesting divide was of the temporal one. And what is the temporal divide that actually happened? The temporal divide was largely about medievalism versus modernity. Now, how do we define modernity? There are ways in which Guizot, Max Weber, they've all defined modernity. Modernity is largely For Weber, it is a structure where everybody becomes part of a transformative structure, cog in the machine. So, rationality became a significant part of Weber's understanding of modernity. So, Weber's understanding of modernity was largely reflected through institutions like bureaucracy. So, rationality became a significant part of the idea of modernity. Karl Marx, of course, he is also another exponent of modernity, who is actually talking about the ways in which capital transform the nature of human nature. So modernity is the way in which capitalism actually transforms human nature. And human nature transforming into a dehumanized, reified subjectivity towards commodification, or what we call as commodity fetishism. So, of course, it will take another 2 lectures to define modernity. But you can say there is a historical category also. Modernity became a historical category, an institutional structure, as well as the definition of human nature also. And that is where we can define modernity. But in this sense, when we actually start looking at why we need to look at the idea of modernity itself, because Renaissance was a precursor to modernity. So how that precursor happened? What was happening in 15th century? The very idea of looking at modernity or Renaissance must be understood from what was happening in the 15th century. In the 15th century, the dark age of Christianity was ending. And as the dark age of Christianity was ending, obviously, the transition was reflected through development in art. Of course, science was gradually developing, but development of art and aesthetic is very, very important. Now, how many of you is anybody aware of Mona Lisa? Anybody heard about
sir.
Mona? Yeah.
It's
What?
think of Leonardo da Vinci.
Okay. Have you seen that?
Yes, sir.
So what is that? Can you describe?
Sir, I heard that eyebrows are not there in that painting.
Okay.
Then also, it looks very beautiful, sir.
So without the eyebrows, it is beautiful. There is a
Yes.
reason, there is a metaphoric reason for why there is no eyebrow. Okay, number one. Second, look at that picture again very carefully. Mona Lisa is smiling, isn't it? And that is a beautiful smile. But Mona Lisa is in tears. You can see droplets of tears on her cheeks. And if you look at very closely, and that is the beauty of Leonardo da Vinci's art, Mona Lisa's face is in a cage. And the cage reflects the dark ages, the smile, the Renaissance, which is trying to like dawn upon the people. But still it is in tears because still the church was executing people like Joan of Arc. You know, Saint Joan of Arc, a 16-year-old teenage girl who used to speak to God, and the church executed her as, of course, later the Catholic Church declared her as the saint when they realized it, but she was publicly hanged. for speaking the truth, that she is able to listen to the words of God. The church said that, how dare you listen to the words of God? Only we are capable and entitled to listen to the words of God. And she was declared as an angel of the Satan and executed. So it's a beautiful story. Not the story, real story. But this is what Renaissance was all about. There was a transition that was happening. Geographically, Europeans were trying to discover themselves. And temporally also they tried to discover themselves. And geographically, the world got strictly divided into Europe and non-Europe. And there was a racial reproduction of that space where superior and inferior races were actually divided. Now that is where Renaissance began to become a precursor to modernity. And what is modernity? As I said, Max Weber, excuse me, Max Weber and Karl Marx, who are the great exponents of the idea of modernity. One was looking at from rationality as a most significant aspect of modernity. The other, Karl Marx, was looking at capitalist accumulation as a most important aspect of modernity. Now, in terms of what we call as Sudipta Kaviraj's definition of modernity, he writes a very interesting piece, a revisionist theory of modernity, where he's bringing the Indian idea of modernity through Gandhi, Bhudev Mukhopadhyay, and now even Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. How Indian idea of modernity, again, of course, we have to go back to another 2 lectures to look at Indian idea of modernity. But this idea of modernity for Sudipta Kaviraj was fivefold. It began with industrialization, capitalist economic transformation, sociological individuation, urbanization. These were some of the major aspects of, and democratization, of course. These were some of the aspects of modernity. But simultaneously, colonialism became a significant aspect. When modernity was talking about liberalism, individual freedom, reason, what was reason? Simon Ptolemy writes a very interesting book where he is actually comparing reason, instrumental reason, to a river flowing under the bridge of reason as a river flowing under the bridge of modernity. Now, what this metaphoric bridge actually symbolizes, we have controlled reason. There is nothing called metaphysics of reason. We have actually captured reason. Tomorrow AI will come, and we all know that is the problem with modernity. So where is reason? Reason can be captured through machines. So when you can build a bridge on the river, obviously you will build all the machines over your reason. And AI will be the best example. ChatGPT. I don't know how many of you use ChatGPT, but try to not use it. The book written by Simon Ptolemy is Cosmopolis, the hidden agenda of modernity. In this sense, as I said, Walter Magnolo is talking about epistemicide that was created by Renaissance. So there were 4 stages that came. And the 5th stage is globalization. So I'll not talk about globalization. We'll be sticking to colonialism and post-colonialism. Renaissance invented time and space. Then we see the advent of modernity with these changes, which Sudipta Kaviraj is explaining. Then we are entering into the age of enlightenment. And this is a very interesting phase. And the 4th stage is the rise of European bourgeois ethno-class. These are the 4 stages, which is very, very significant, which Walter Magnolo actually explains in his book, The Darker Side of Western Modernity and Darker Side of Renaissance. In this sense, enlightenment, we celebrate it. We have studied in school that something happened. Who were enlightened? Of course, we were not enlightened because we were enlightened 5,000 years ago itself. So we never lived in the age of darkness. The Europeans, of course, they forgot Greco-Roman grandeur and they became subservient to the church dogma. Church dogma. You know, Paul Feyerabend, a philosopher of science, talks about church dogma. And it is church dogma which actually made human reason subservient to the theological tyranny. When I say theological tyranny, it is not my words. Bertrand Russell writes a book, Why I Am Not a Christian. Kancha Ilaiah copied this and then wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Hindu. Of course, this is out of context, but I remembered, so that's why I say. So why I am not a Christian? He says religion being transformed into a code of violence. If you don't do this, you will be punished, you will be killed, you will be executed. If you don't do this, you have to pay this much. Religion became tyranny, tyranny of the church, organized crime. The Catholic Church became like an organized crime. But of course, that was the darker side of Christianity, Catholicism especially, because Christianity completely cannot be blamed because there were other forms of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Southern Orthodox Church, the Methodists, so they can't be blamed. So the Catholicism, which dominated European imagination for thousands of years, they in a way tried to liberate. The Treaty of Westphalia happened. And Enlightenment gave way for modern thinking in science, technology. But what was Europe thinking about others at this time? That is more important for us. Europeans were actually thinking in terms of a superiority complex that became very, very intense after in the 18th century rather. What was happening in the 17th century then? The age of enlightenment. The Europeans began to go to distant unknown territories, plant their banners and say that this is our space. So forcefully capturing spaces in the Americas and especially in the context of America and Africa. Eisenstadt, in the context of America, critiques colonization of America as the wiping out of 3 aboriginal races. The Red Indians completely wiped out, and other 2 original natives completely wiped out. The Hispanics. And today, still racism prevails heavily in America. Trump's America. So that is why Trump wanted to create fences to prevent the Mexicans to enter the US, the impure races. But anyways, in this sense, the idea of looking at the 17th century as the Europeans thought that they had invented the world and others have to follow us. Sanjay Seth writes a very interesting book, Beyond Reason. Now, why were the social sciences invented, like history, anthropology? History was invented to show that there were some people who were primitive, like us, India, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And there were some people who were modern, Europeans especially the Anglosphere. Anthropology was invented to create the idea of a superior and inferior humans. The white, mature, rational men, the brown, effeminate Indians, and the black, brutish Africans. Franz Fanon critiqued this idea as the wretched of the earth. Wretched of the earth. And what was Franz Fanon referring to? The blacks as not humans. The whites driven by reason. The brown people driven by effeminacy, in the sense they were weak. But the blacks driven only by animal instincts, hunger, sexual desire, nothing beyond that. So the black was an animal from top to bottom. So in his work, Black Skin, White Masks, the black was a metaphoric symbol for fear. If small children were being naughty, they were not sleeping, you say a Negro will come and eat you. जैसे हमारे यहाँ बोलते हैं गब्बर आ जाएगा, बेटा सो जाओ. फिर बाद में गब्बर के 3 लोगों ने उसका नाम मिट्टी में मिला दिया था. Anyway, so we have to end by 3:15 or 3:20. What is the break time?
3:15, sir.
3:15.
Yes, sir.
And in 3 minutes. And what time we resume? 3:45?
Yes, sir. 3:45 we have to be back, sir.
Okay. So, yeah. So what was happening in 17th century was an interesting way in which the Europeans were colonizing other territories because they thought that they were superior and they deserved to be colonized. The Africans, the Indians, they thought that they are only deserved to be colonized, they are deserved to be ruled, they are deserved to be subjugated. So there was an alterity of doubleness. Alterity is something, a complex of superiority in terms of a colonial language. In this sense, on the other hand, it is not the case that Europeans did not critique imperialism. Sankar Muthu writes a book, Enlightenment Against Empire. Enlightenment Against Empire. Somebody like Rousseau, who critiqued imperialism as against the liberty of humans. Henry Diderot. They were all critiques of imperialism. But there were supporters of imperialism also. Somebody like Adam Smith was a supporter of imperialism. Immanuel Kant, Hegel, they were supporters of imperialism. Sankar Muthu writes, and similarly, Jennifer Pitts also writes a critique of European imperialism. But despite these criticisms, the Europeans were able to imperialize or colonize spaces, and India became a significant place after Vasco da Gama had sniffed the wonderful fragrance of spices. So, especially chilies,